It was the winter of 1944, and the snow that covered Europe no longer brought the promise of purity or renewal. For many German soldiers trudging through the mud and frost of the Eastern Front, it was simply another reminder that the world had turned cold, and that their belief in victory, in leadership, and even in survival was fading with every breath. The war that had once seemed unstoppable was now devouring the very men who had built it. These soldiers, raised on years of propaganda promising glory and destiny, were beginning to realize that the thousand-year Reich would not survive even a decade. Across the ruined landscape of Europe, the Wehrmacht, once the most feared military machine on earth, was unraveling under the strain of endless retreat. The Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, an expanse so vast that even the German generals struggled to comprehend it. Soviet artillery thundered day and night. The frozen earth shook beneath the weight of advancing Red Army tanks. In 1941, these same soldiers had marched east with confidence, believing they were part of a crusade against communism, a campaign that would bring a new order to Europe. But by 1944, the songs of victory had been replaced by silence, broken only by the sounds of boots crunching through snow and the whispers of men who no longer believed. Letters home spoke less of triumph and more of hunger, fear, and disbelief. "We were told the Russians were finished," one soldier wrote, "but they never stop coming. There are too many of them. Too many to kill, too many to count." Inside Germany, civilians were enduring their own war, one of fear and exhaustion. Cities that had once glowed with Nazi banners and parades now lay in ashes after relentless Allied bombing. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, names that once represented pride now symbolized ruin. Families lived in cellars, surviving on watery soup and fragments of faith that their sons at the front might still come home. The turning point, historians often note, wasn't a single battle, but a collective realization. By mid-1944, it was becoming clear to many Germans, both at home and at the front, that the promises of their Führer were empty. The war was lost, only the dying remained. Yet even as defeat loomed, the regime demanded total faith. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels continued to broadcast messages of final victory, urging the population to fight to the last breath. Posters showed smiling soldiers and farmers under slogans like "Victory or Death." But in the trenches, the men who saw the truth in front of them could no longer be swayed by words. They saw friends buried in frozen soil, comrades burned alive in their tanks, and entire units vanish under artillery fire. And they asked themselves a question that no German soldier dared to ask before: what are we fighting for? The German army was still vast, but its heart had changed. The machine that once believed in destiny was now held together by fear and duty alone. For some, desertion became an act of sanity, though punishable by execution. For others, the only escape was surrender. In the West, after the Normandy landings, German troops faced an unstoppable tide. The beaches that Hitler promised would be impenetrable fortresses fell within hours. In the East, the Red Army's Operation Bagration obliterated entire divisions, erasing the once proud Army Group Center from the map. By the end of that summer, thousands of German soldiers were being captured every week. In their faces, Allied correspondents noted something new, not the defiance of a beaten army, but the exhaustion of men who had already stopped believing. Even high-ranking officers began to see the futility. Some plotted to end the madness themselves. On July 20th, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb beneath the table in Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters. The explosion tore through the room, killing several officers, but Hitler survived. The conspiracy failed, and with it, the last hope for a negotiated peace. What followed was a purge. Thousands were arrested, hundreds executed. Yet the very fact that such a plot had existed showed the crumbling faith within the German ranks. For the first time, the illusion of unity was broken. Still, the fighting continued. Orders were absolute, punishment swift. Even as Germany's enemies closed in from all sides, Hitler refused retreat. He demanded that every man fight to the death, not for victory, but for ideology. But ideology could no longer sustain the dying. Across the front lines, German soldiers surrendered in growing numbers. Some wept with relief, Others felt only shame. Soviet soldiers looked on with grim satisfaction, for they too had suffered unspeakable losses, driven by their own machinery of fear and propaganda. It was not simply a military collapse, it was the slow disintegration of belief itself. In a letter intercepted by Allied forces in late 1944, one German officer wrote to his wife, "We no longer believe in the things we once did. We fight because there is nothing else left to do." The German soldier had not only lost the war, he had lost his reason to fight it. As 1944 progressed, the war had become a story of attrition rather than strategy. Across both fronts, soldiers were no longer fighting for grand ideas or national destiny. They were fighting to endure another day, to survive long enough to see their families once more, or at least to survive the next barrage of artillery fire. The Wehrmacht, which had once been a highly disciplined, offensive force, now found itself stretched to the breaking point. Supplies ran thin, morale plummeted, and the illusion of invincibility crumbled in the face of relentless opposition. In the east, the Red Army pressed with a combination of sheer manpower and unyielding determination. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of brutal fighting, pushed westward through forests and rivers, their tactics refined from decades of experience and driven by a ferocious desire to reclaim their homeland. They advanced relentlessly, often encountering German divisions that were barely functional, lacking both equipment and the will to fight. German officers noted that entire units would sometimes melt away under pressure, not through fear of death alone, but because the men no longer believed in the cause they were asked to defend. Meanwhile, in the West, Allied forces launched operation after operation designed to wear down the German army systematically. From the beaches of Normandy to the hedgerows of France, soldiers witnessed the complete collapse of Hitler's strategic planning. Orders from Berlin were increasingly disconnected from reality. Commanders at the front frequently ignored them, improvising as best they could to preserve their men. Even the elite units, which had once struck fear across Europe, began showing cracks. The soldiers understood that no amount of discipline could reverse the momentum of overwhelming Allied force. It was not just the soldiers who suffered. German civilians, especially in the cities, endured nightly air raids that destroyed homes, schools, and hospitals. Families scavenged for food, water, and warmth in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. They listened to radio broadcasts that promised victory and triumph, yet each day brought new evidence to the contrary. Children grew up seeing only the ruins of streets where they had once played, while parents faced the impossible choice of sending sons to the front or watching them die in the conflict from afar. The dissonance between reality and propaganda weighed heavily on the soldiers as well. Nazi messaging insisted that the Reich would endure, that German soldiers were the best equipped and most resolute on earth, and that the enemy was overstretched and weak. But the men at the front saw frozen bodies, deserted villages, and advancing forces that seemed inexhaustible. Many began to question not only the strategy, but the very purpose of the war itself. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed despairing voices. "We are no longer fighting for Germany. We fight to avoid being killed." The failure of morale was compounded by the crumbling supply lines. Trucks broke down on muddy roads, ammunition was scarce, and winter clothing was insufficient against the freezing temperatures of Eastern Europe. Soldiers were often forced to make impossible choices: hold their positions or retreat, steal food to survive, or risk execution for desertion. The lines between duty, self-preservation, and rebellion blurred. By late 1944, German military intelligence itself recognized the psychological collapse spreading through the ranks. Amid these hardships, the war had begun to reveal cracks not only in the German army, but within its leadership. Hitler's insistence on rigid adherence to orders, even when strategically nonsensical, alienated many senior officers. Commanders who had once revered him as infallible now questioned his judgment privately, understanding that each day of stubborn resistance brought only further death and destruction. Some attempted small acts of defiance. Others plotted larger schemes, like the failed July 20 assassination attempt, which, despite its failure, demonstrated that even within the highest echelons of power, belief in the Führer was eroding. The psychological toll on the German soldier cannot be overstated. Soldiers described the feeling of being trapped in a war that was already lost. Every battlefield presented the same picture: friends killed, positions overrun, towns burned. Their trust in victory had vanished. Their fear of punishment was what kept them moving forward. Some found solace in camaraderie, clinging to one another to survive. Others resigned themselves to fate, marching mechanically, haunted by the knowledge that the orders they followed were meaningless. On the other side, Allied soldiers, whether American, British, or Soviet, recognized this growing despair. Field reports frequently mentioned surrendering units with little resistance, men whose eyes betrayed exhaustion and a loss of faith. Allied commanders understood that the psychological collapse of Germany's forces was as critical as any military maneuver. By exploiting these weaknesses, they could advance with fewer losses and bring the war to its conclusion more swiftly. In the midst of retreat and defeat, some German soldiers began acts of humanity that defied orders. They spared prisoners, left towns intact when possible, or refused to execute the most extreme directives. These small gestures were acts of conscience, reflecting the moral reckoning that was unfolding among men who had been trained to obey without question. The very act of refusing to believe the propaganda was, in a way, a survival mechanism and a moral stand. Germany's eventual defeat was inevitable, but the collapse of belief came first. Soldiers who had once seen themselves as part of a grand destiny found themselves confronting the stark reality that ideology could not shield them from hunger, death, and despair. By late 1944, the narrative that had sustained the German army for years was gone. What remained was a desperate struggle to endure, to survive, and for some, to make small acts of resistance against a regime they no longer trusted. By the winter of 1944–1945, the situation for Germany was beyond recovery. The combined pressures of relentless Allied advances in the West and the unstoppable Soviet tide from the East left the German army fractured and demoralized. Soldiers who had once marched with pride now moved with the weary precision of men who had seen too much and believed too little. The faith that had sustained them for years, the idea that they were part of a historical mission, that victory was achievable through discipline and courage, had evaporated. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army advanced toward Berlin, pushing through towns and villages with an almost industrial efficiency. German units, often reduced to skeletons of their former selves, were forced to retreat day after day. Many soldiers surrendered not out of cowardice, but from a recognition that continued resistance would serve only death. Letters and diaries from this period reveal the grim pragmatism that now ruled the hearts of men who had once fought with zeal. One soldier wrote, "We no longer fight for Germany or for Hitler or for glory. We fight because the alternative is death." The collapse of belief was not limited to the battlefield. Within Germany itself, the populace had begun to understand that the promises of victory were hollow. Cities had been flattened by Allied bombing raids. Families huddled in cellars, surviving on minimal rations, their lives defined by fear and deprivation. Propaganda still blared on radios, insisting on heroic triumph, but the citizens knew that the Reich was failing. Mothers wrote letters to sons at the front pleading for their survival, only to receive news of yet another defeat. Children grew up with death and destruction as their daily companions. Even among senior officers, the veneer of unity had shattered. The failure of the July 20 assassination attempt, though intended to end Hitler's rule, demonstrated the fractures within the German command structure. Some officers still followed orders to the letter, believing in duty, while others quietly sabotaged plans or sought surrender when possible. This divided approach mirrored the mental state of the troops, a mixture of obedience, resignation, and quiet defiance. In the West, the Allied advance following D-Day had crushed German hopes of turning the tide. The once formidable Atlantic Wall had been breached, and every defensive line was ultimately overrun. German soldiers found themselves trapped in a war they no longer believed in. forced into hopeless defensive positions and facing increasingly mechanized and coordinated opposition. At times, surrender seemed the only rational choice, and mass capitulations became more frequent as the months progressed. The human toll of this collapse was staggering. Soldiers who had once been ideologically committed now wrestled with guilt and shame. They had seen atrocities committed in their name, been ordered to commit acts they could not morally justify, and yet survived to question the meaning of it all. Some turned to writing, recording the horrors and moral compromises they had endured. Others clung to the camaraderie of their fellow soldiers as the only remaining source of solace. On the Allied side, the psychological impact of encountering a broken enemy was not lost. American, British, and Soviet soldiers observed the difference between the German army of 1940–1941 and the depleted forces of late 1944. The same soldiers who had once been invincible now hesitated, retreated, or surrendered in large numbers. Military historians note that the erosion of morale often accelerated the operational collapse, shortening the war in Europe and reducing casualties on both sides. In Berlin, as the Red Army approached, the city's defenders faced the ultimate test. Many soldiers stationed there had seen the front lines crumble elsewhere and understood that their own situation was hopeless. Yet orders from Hitler forbade retreat or surrender. The result was a desperate defense of a city already doomed. Soldiers, civilians, and even teenagers were pressed into service, a final demonstration of obedience in the face of futility. The fall of Berlin would soon become the final symbol of the collapse of German belief, a tragic monument to men and women trapped between ideology and survival. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 marked not only the end of hostilities, but also the end of an era defined by faith, loyalty, and illusion. Soldiers who had once fought for glory now returned home as men haunted by what they had witnessed and what they had been forced to do. Civilians, too, faced the challenge of rebuilding lives amidst the ruins of a country they had been told was invincible. The war had stripped away illusions, leaving only the stark truths of survival, moral compromise, and the human cost of ideology. In retrospect, the collapse of German morale provides a crucial lesson about war and humanity. Victory is never solely determined by weapons, strategy, or numbers. It is also determined by belief, trust, and the willingness of people to endure. When soldiers stop believing, even the strongest armies falter and the machinery of war grinds to a halt. The human dimension, the erosion of hope, the moral reckoning, and the weight of despair is as decisive as any battle plan or technological advantage. In the end, the story of Germany's soldiers in late WWII is a story of disillusionment and survival. It is the story of men and women caught in the tide of history, struggling to maintain dignity and conscience while confronting a reality far harsher than any ideology could prepare them for. Their experiences serve as both a warning and a lesson. In war, the collapse of belief can be more destructive than any bomb, more decisive than any tank, and more enduring than any victory.